Good evening and Happy New Year. Welcome to the first membership meeting of 2025. We're happy to have you joining us for tonight's program. I'm Debbie Mullins, the president, and I call this meeting to order. Before I introduce Dr. Liz Derryberry, I have a few short announcements to make. The annual meeting of the Linnaean Society, our 147th annual meeting, in fact, is on Tuesday, March the 11th at the Liederkranz Club on East 87th Street. Dr. Brian Watts will receive the Eisenman Medal at the meeting, the highest award bestowed by the Society, and he'll be giving the keynote address on Eagles of the Chesapeake. The annual meeting is open only to dues-paying members of the Society, so if you forgot to pay your dues last fall, please take care of that now. And if you're not a member, please join us so you can attend this really fun meeting. Our membership application is on the website, linnaeannewyork.org/members. We'll be having a raffle and a silent auction to defray the cost of the meeting. If you have an item to donate or an activity you could provide, like a guided bird walk at your favorite patch, please contact our secretary, Amanda Bielskis, at secretary@linnaeannewyork.org. Last month, I told you about the Horseshoe Crab Protection Act that was awaiting Governor Hochul's signature. This bill would have further tightened restrictions on taking of horseshoe crabs for use as bait. Unfortunately, the governor vetoed this legislation, feeling that its passage would harm the commercial fishing industry in New York. Currently, the take on horseshoe crabs is regulated by the State Department of Environmental Conservation, so they will continue to monitor the take of horseshoe crabs. And lastly, in the last month, 7 people have joined the Society, and I'd like to introduce them now. They're Michelle Davis, Victoria Emboscado, Edward Gillard, Madiha Hanif, Brad Wells, Robert Young, and Richard Zeman. So welcome all of you to the Linnaean Society. I hope you'll attend the annual meeting so that we can meet you in person. So let's turn to our program now. As usual, you'll see that we have muted your microphone and disabled the chat function. So if you would like to ask a question of Dr. Derryberry, please type it into the Q&A feature. And after the presentation, Vice President Doug Futuma will moderate the question and answer session. Liz Derryberry is a 2000 graduate of Princeton University, where she majored in ecology and evolutionary biology. In 2007, she completed her doctoral dissertation work at Duke University on the cultural evolution of songs in white-crowned sparrows. She then joined the Museum of Natural Science at Louisiana State University to study speciation processes in neotropical ovenbirds and wood creepers. After 5 years as faculty at Tulane University, she joined the Ecology and Evolutionary Biology faculty at the University of Knoxville in 2017. The title of her presentation tonight is Non-Parallel Behavioral Responses to Soundscape Perturbations During the COVID-19 Pandemic. So welcome, Liz. We're very happy to have you tonight.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, and thank you for the invitation. So I'm going to attempt to share my screen now, so if everybody could bear with me for one moment. Okay, I think that worked.
Looks great.
Oh, great. Thank you. So it's really exciting to be here today. I really appreciate the invitation. And I want to share today some work that's been going on in some ways for a very long time, for 25 years. But also in some ways, it's really new to me still. So that's kind of exciting when you find a system that keeps throwing up new questions. So today I want to talk about some of the work that we have done looking at animal behavior and how it responds to changes in human behavior during the COVID-19 pandemic. But first, I want to start by thanking a lot of people that have been involved in this work. Graduate students who are now faculty, like Jenny Phillips, collected a lot of the data that I'm talking about today in collaboration with me. David Luther, who's a longtime collaborator at George Mason University, and really convinced me to start working on the urban populations of white-crowned sparrows. And then I also want to highlight Graham Derryberry, who's my brother, who, without whose coding skills, a lot of the analyses that I have done would not be possible. So I want to start in my favorite place in the world, which is Tioga Pass Meadow in the Sierra Nevada. This is where I first did my first fieldwork as an undergraduate, and I somehow keep finding my way back to this population, in part because it is chock full of these guys, white-crowned sparrows. And so white-crowned sparrows, even though some might call them the field rat of behavioral ecology, are quite handsome little birds, and I love their songs. So here's a white-crowned sparrow singing. If you're really good at your dialects, you'll hear that he's actually singing an Alaska song and not a California song. But this is a great video of a bird singing. And so here he's singing. We know in white crowns that mainly males sing, although females occasionally will sing. And he's singing to do primarily two things, we think. One is to repel rivals from his territory. So effectively, he's saying, this is mine. And the other is to attract females who may be listening to him as potential mates. And so what's really interesting about these songs to me is that we can take this really beautiful, complex behavior or phenotype, and we can collect a lot of great data on it. So if we take that same sound, so this is the song that that bird is singing right now, and we take it and do a fast Fourier analysis, and we can turn it into this visual image where we have time along the x-axis and frequency along the y-axis here. Or we can think of this as pitch. And we can take a lot of data from this. We can do things that humans are really good at, still better than AI, which is to actually put these notes into categories or types of notes. So like a simple whistle or a more complex buzz. We can also take a lot of quantitative data. So here I've illustrated how you can measure, say, the maximum frequency in that song and the minimum frequency, the difference between that being the frequency bandwidth. We can also take information like the start of a note or the end of a note and figure out the duration of those components. And all of these types of measures we can use to start asking questions about how this trait varies and why it varies. So I have two research questions that I've been working on for a long time. So that all of my work somehow seems to boil down to these two questions, which is how does the environment affect the evolution of song? And what do I mean by that? So there's a lot of amazing work that's been done. And here is just one example from Endler thinking about signal detection theory. And this is the idea that selection is going to act on organisms, right? And it's going to favor behaviors or signals like the song, receptors, so the receivers that are listening to this, as well as the behaviors that are used in producing that song to maximize that signal relative to the noise that's coming from the background, so environmental noise, and look and work for ways to minimize signal degradation. So selection is going to favor those traits that are going to maximize that signal to noise ratio and allow receivers to detect that signal. If you can't hear it, what's the point? The other question is, what are the functional consequences of song evolution? And so what do I mean by that? Well, in this case, we're thinking, I think, primarily about sexual selection theory, which goes all the way back to Darwin, of course, everything does. And this is the idea that selection is going to act on these same traits in ways to maximize the number of mates you can attract and the quality of those mates. So for example, we might just take this given behavioral trait, which is here how well this male is singing this really fast song, so this motor constraint on producing the signal. And we know that females are interested in this. So they listen, they assess males and their ability to perform this trade-off, and that this can lead to, has fitness consequences then for the male. And I think about both of these questions in the context of communication. So I'm really interested in the sort of dual function nature of this signal. So this is male-female communication as well as male-male communication as illustrated here. Because if we think about selection acting on these behaviors in different populations, or even over time, we can imagine that there's going to be changes in these behaviors in ways that you may no longer recognize each other as a potential mate. And any kind of breakdown in communication, right, can have ultimate consequences for how gene flow works. Okay, so these two questions are really important to me, and I've thought about them in a lot of different contexts. So, one is thinking about microevolutionary processes, which is what I'm going to talk about today. So, this goes all the way back to my dissertation, which is thinking about how environmental changes affect the song over time, so generation to generation, as well as macroevolutionary patterns. As Debbie mentioned, doing my postdoctoral work on suboscenes and thinking about how these different species, these amazingly colorful and acoustically diverse species vary and how the environment and the morphology has affected how those songs have evolved over time. And the sort of in between that micro and macro, one might say, and thinking about hybrid zones, which is where species come together and interbreed. And we can look at how those traits might be involved, traits like song traits might be involved in how those populations evolve or change over time. And then finally, thinking about anthropogenic effects. And so that's where I'm going to focus today is that component of my work. Although I have to admit, I'm a very reluctant urban ecologist. I have always been really much more into field work in remote areas. And so the work that I have done on white crowns more recently in these urban soundscapes has been really fulfilling in a lot of ways, but also really challenging. So why have I gotten interested in cities? So cities are interesting to me from an evolution perspective because they're so evolutionarily recent, right? And so we can think about a lot of different ways that humans are changing the world around us, right? We know we can sit and just think for a moment about all the different ways that we modify our environment. We think about things like landscape change, which has been going on for a very long period of time, albeit with urbanization, that tempo has really increased. So that has its own sort of difference in its selection pressure on organisms. But to me, what's really fascinating is thinking about these sensory pollutants. So light pollution is illustrated here, as well as noise pollution, and how those changes are evolutionarily unprecedented. Like no time in the sort of evolutionary history of these organisms have they been exposed to this sort of sensory pollution. And so I'm really interested in how organisms deal with that and how they respond to it. And so I specifically, because I study song, I like studying song. I think about noise a lot. And so how does noise affect how birds sing? And so when we look at this map of noise and specifically in the United States, you can find your favorite city, much like you could on the past map, but this is not light. This is actually noise levels. And we can see that if we move past the cities, that almost all of the map is transected by these roads, right? So noise is not just something that happens in the city; it happens everywhere. So what does that mean for our bird that's singing in the city? Okay, so we took that same song that we heard that white-crowned sparrow singing before, and now we're going to look at it in a slightly different way. So now I'm going to take sound and I'm going to flip the axes, and I'm going to put pitch or frequency down here on the x-axis, and amplitude, so the energy that's contained in each frequency at the y-axis. And so here's that same song, and it makes sense, right? So when we thought about that minimum and maximum frequency, right, they're sort of between 3 and 6 kilohertz here, right? So that's where all the power is in this song. We can then think about how a bird might detect it, right? Because we're thinking about communication. So we want to think about the part that's relevant to the receiver. So this blue line reflects the ability for the receiver to detect each of these frequencies at this amplitude. So everything above that blue line, say a female white-crowned sparrow can hear. Now, if we put noise over the background, so this black area is showing us noise levels, and so this is specifically looks like a profile for a city. So if we think about rumbling cars and HVAC systems, right, we have a lot of high energy at low frequencies down here, right, and it kind of tapers off at higher frequencies. Now, if we think about how the bird hears in noise, right, this is that black line. It's really quite terrible, right? They don't hear very much. That's something I always point out to people, which is a kind of a fun fact, at least for these white-crowned sparrows, is that they're really not good at hearing. So if I, as a human, can just detect a bird singing, another white-crowned sparrow would have to be, at the- you know, um, twice as close, basically, to that bird to hear it, right? So they hear more poorly in noise than we do. And so we might think about how might white crown sparrow deal with this sitting noise. Well, they could shift to higher frequencies. So we can imagine the song shifting up and they would capture, the receiver would be able to hear more of that song. They could sing louder, right? So we get more area above that line. We can imagine that they could just change when they're singing. Don't sing when there's a lot of traffic, right? Don't sing at rush hour. And so if noise levels are going down, right, you're going to hear more of that sound, more of that song. We could decrease the territory, right? If you can't hear at the same distance anymore, maybe the receivers all just get closer, right? So you have much smaller territories. It could be that you change your perceptual abilities. So this is an idea that hasn't been explored as much. There's not as much known about, but in theory, you could have differences in how well you can detect songs and noise in different populations. Or you could just give up on song and switch to a visual signal, right? And that's another possibility. So how you might adjust to this city noise. And so many of these things we've actually shown over time. And we did work for almost, I guess, 10 years thinking about these questions and showed support for a lot of these things. We see that white crowned sparrows that have noisier territories sing at higher frequencies and they sing at higher amplitudes, they sing louder. Um, some of them alter their time of singing, although we don't see as much of an effect there. We do see smaller territories, so they seem to decrease their territory size in louder areas or higher noise levels. But we still don't know much about the perceptual abilities or their visual signals. So normally that used to be the talk that I gave before COVID. But then COVID came along and it gave us, I'd say this is like a very tiny, tiny silver lining to the pandemic, which was that it was a sort of novel quasi experiment, right? So on a whole landscape scale, suddenly it got quiet. And this gave us a chance to really think about how does changes in human movement affect animal behavior. And so, of course, I'm not the only person who thought of this, right? I mean, scientists everywhere were sort of like, how do we think about this? How do we quantify this? How do we look at the effect of this huge change globally in our life? And so, this is work showing by Roots, sort of this idea of thinking about human behavior changing. So this anthropause is what he called it during that initial lockdown, and then thinking about theoretically, as you come out of lockdown, that there might be a pulse in human activity. And so thinking about these sort of changes in human mobility and how that might affect the environment. And so there's an amazing amount of science that's still coming out, looking at this across a lot of different metrics. And I like to think about, Roots didn't talk about it in this way, but I like to think about sort of pulling in this other ecological terms and thinking about how to frame the question of what's happening here. And so one idea is this idea of robustness. And so the robustness of a system is how difficult is it to perturb the function of that system away from its baseline behavior. And resilience, which is how easily, once it's been perturbed, how quickly does it revert to its original behavior. So we use these words resilience all the time in our common language, but here I'm defining them specifically as robustness being essentially you're tweaking the system, what happens to it, how hard is it to push it away from what it normally does, and resilience is how quickly does it come back after being affected. And so my question today is, does behavioral plasticity in the form of the singing bird facilitate this robustness and resilience by maintaining how that acoustic signal, how that song works in this changing soundscape? So what do I mean by that? So I think about communication during the pandemic. So again, our function is to communicate. It's to have receivers hear you and respond and change their behavior. I want to define here no noise as the baseline state. You could do it a couple different ways. This is something I really thought about a lot. Like, is the baseline the noise level that's in the city right now? But then it gets very complicated to think about that. So I'm defining no noise as the baseline. And so then we can think about when the lockdown happened, right? When you took noise out of the system, How quickly did the system return to its baseline? What's the resilience? Versus putting noise back in as the lockdown is lifted, we can look at how that behavior responds, and that'll give us a measure of the robustness of that communication system. Okay, so what did we do? So this is a map of San Francisco right here, and then the Bay Area around it, as well as Marin up here. If you've never been, this is gorgeous. You should go immediately. That's it's nice to work up here. Down in the city, maybe not so much. And so you can see in gray is where we have lots of urbanization. The land is really developed, right? This is a huge city. And then really green areas is a sort of forest and grassland. So what's nice about this is you have a very rural system right next to a very urbanized system across a very short distance. And so around San Francisco, we were working on white-crowned sparrows, and we had urban areas that are here in red, rural areas in blue, and we have measurements, we have data from before COVID. So we have this year 2016, which is the year that we had the sort of the most robust sampling, the broadest sampling of all these sites. And then during that initial lockdown in 2020, and then after the lockdown, so each breeding season since then, so white-crowned sparrows, although they're resident, they only breed during the so spring and summer. And so we can look at specifically in that breeding season each year, what do their songs look like? So we have a couple different things. So what do these data look like? So what this looks like is you go out in the field, you hear white crowns singing, and you walk up to a male's territory, and we map out where that bird is, and then we take noise level readings on his territory, so we quantify how loud it is, and then we also measure his song. Now, white crowns are nice because they, in some ways, they're useful this way, is that they tend to sing one song, and and they sing it over and over. And most males in the area sing almost identical songs, which is why they're often called dialects in this bird. And so the sampling that we have across this area represents 4 different dialects. And from those songs, we measure the amplitude of the song, so how much energy is at those frequencies, which is challenging in the field. We have a really complex method for doing that, which I'm not going to describe today, but I'm happy to talk about more if people have questions, as well as the minimum frequency of the song. Because if we think about it, that high energy noise is at low frequencies. And so that's the part of the song that's most likely to be covered up or masked by that noise, is the minimum frequency. So what does this mean? Why does song amplitude and minimum frequency matter? Well, the higher your amplitude and the higher the minimum frequency and noise, the greater that your song can travel, the greater the communication distance. And we know that in these birds and white crowns, the greater the communication distance you have that your song has, the larger the territory you can defend. So there's a functional consequence to how how you're singing, right? And so we know that these traits are showing something about the signal efficacy. So we have one more trait that we're going to talk about today, which is vocal performance. So what is that? So vocal performance is this motor, it's how well a male performs a specific motor constraint. So what do I mean by that? So here we have this lovely swamp sparrow who's singing his beautiful trilled song. So this is a series of notes repeated over and over. And as he's singing, he actually is producing harmonic frequencies at his larynx, at his syrinx, which is like our larynx or his voice box. And as that sound is moving through his vocal tract, he is changing the length and the conformation of it, and also altering how he's opening and closing his beak so that he can filter out those frequencies. And that's why you get that such a pure, beautiful tone to so many Austen songs, is that they're actively filtering out these harmonic frequencies. And so as he's doing this, you can see at high frequencies, his beak is more open. Think about it like a piccolo, emphasizing that high frequency. At these low frequencies, his beak is more closed. And so think about it like a flute. So he's emphasizing those lower frequencies. And so as he's singing, he's actively opening and closes his beak rapidly and widely. And we see this as the case across a lot of different songbirds. This is work by Jeff Potos, showing that across embryzids, or as they were defined in the 1990s, we see that at really fast trills, they have narrow bandwidths, but at slow trills, they have both wide and narrow. What this means is if you're singing really fast, it's hard to open your beak really wide, right? So you're limited in how widely and rapidly you can open your beak. And we can define that triangular distribution by this performance limit. So you can imagine the closer you are to that line, the harder it is to produce that song, that motor constraint. And so that has implications for the salience or potency of that signal if we're thinking about communication. So we think of songs as close to the limit as high and far from the limit as low performance. We know that in a bunch of different species, including white-crowned sparrows, as I've illustrated here, that birds care. So we see, this is one example from males, that they approach high performance songs more closely when there's a simulated intruder. So we know that the birds are listening, they're detecting this variation, and they're responding differently based on whether it's a bird that's performing his song well or performing it not as well. Okay, so it brings us to predictions. So what did we think would happen during the lockdown? Um, so we thought people should be at home, so there should be less traffic. We thought with less traffic, there should be less noise, and particularly at low frequencies where we sort of hear that hum of traffic. If noise levels decline, then we thought birds should either maintain or improve their signal to noise ratio, right? So they should really be working to maintain that communication distance or the function of their signal. And they should also maintain or improve these performance metrics, right? Because remember, we thought signal detection theory, sexual selection theory, these tell us that selection should act on these birds in ways, right, to maintain or improve these characteristics. And if we find support for this, this would suggest that our system is highly resilient. Okay, so what did we find? So this is my screenshot, which I had this one file that I took during the height of the pandemic. This is from TomTom. I don't know if anybody uses this app, but they have beautiful ways of visualizing their data. And you can see that basically before the lockdown in San Francisco, there was a lot of traffic. I'm sure that's not shocking. And that after the lockdown, there was almost no traffic. It was amazing. You could drive across the Golden Gate Bridge or the Bay Bridge with like no issues at all. So it really was a huge change in mobility. And our recordings that I'm talking about today are from these 3 weeks at the height of the lockdown, which also coincided with the height of the breeding season. We're right at that peak when they were establishing territories and attracting females. So the timing lined up and allowed us to really look at how this was affecting the song behavior at a time when the males are really singing a lot. So what did we find? So we did find that noise levels are lower, um, perhaps not surprisingly, and we can do this comparison. Again, urban is in red, rural is in blue. I'm going to use that through the rest of the talk. And you can see that noise levels dropped in urban areas more so than rural. I like to say that the ocean did not go away. The ocean was still outside of Marin, and so of course the noise level stayed about the same. While in the city, they dropped by about 7 decibels. So 7 doesn't seem like a big number, but it is. So decibels are in a log scale. And so a 6 decibels is a doubling of the sound pressure level. So a 7 decibel drop means, I mean, that's a huge change in how loud it is, right? It's much, much quieter. And then we can look again at where that energy is at different frequencies. And what we find is that this dashed red line, there's a lot before the pandemic, before the lockdown, there's a lot of energy at these low frequencies. But during the lockdown, see the solid red line, it is almost the same as the blue lines, as the rural lines. So we lost a lot of energy from those lower frequencies. Did we find support for our predictions? Well, song amplitudes were lower. I'm going to warn everybody right now that this is not the best data on song amplitude because we only happen to have a few measures of amplitude from before the pandemic because we basically got a new piece of equipment and had just briefly tried it out that season. And then, of course, we were able to do a lot more of that recording in 2020. But we did find for the songs that we had that there was a shift down. So essentially, in purple is before we have birds singing up around 80 decibels at 1 meter. And so that's pretty typical for a songbird. But then during COVID, we had a lot of songs that were down in this 70 to 75, so much lower amplitude. And what's important is even though they're singing at a lower amplitude, that signal to noise ratio is higher. So it got so much quieter that even though the birds were singing at a lower amplitude, you could still hear them at a much greater distance. That signal how much power was in the signal was so much greater than how much energy was in that noise. So a big shift. In terms of song traits, remember we looked at minimum frequency. Again, we find in rural areas there's no change, but in urban areas, songs shifted down. So the way I like to think about this is that if noise is dropping out of that space, that acoustic space, right, noise levels have declined, that gives room for that minimum frequency to drop down again. It's not being masked by noise. And so we see what we predicted, that minimum frequency decreases, which allows bandwidth to increase, right? So we get this higher measure of vocal performance. So again, we see a little bit of a change in rural areas. So this is just a reflection of year-to-year changes in that measure, but we see a huge shift in urban areas. So almost 11-point shift. And we know from our behavioral work that they start detecting this around 5 to 6 points different. So they can clearly detect this amount of change in vocal performance. Okay, so we find support for all of these predictions, suggesting that we have a resilient communication system. This is not surprising. This makes sense, right? We expect that behavior is pretty flexible. It's going to respond to changing environmental pressures. And we see the direction that we would predict based on our existing knowledge of how signal efficacy and potency work in this system. So what about post-lockdown? So we thought, okay, people are going back to work. Of course, it's San Francisco, so that didn't quite happen the way we thought it was going to happen. That more traffic should increase our noise levels, and that again, if the selection is acting on these birds the way we think it should, we should still see this maintenance of signal to noise ratio and maintain or improve song performance metrics. And that would suggest a robust system. So again, back to TomTom with this great visualization of data. What we see here is that this blue line is before the lockdown, and then the dark blue is 2020. So traffic went down by a lot, as we saw before. And then you could see in 2021, it was creeping back up, right? So we see people starting to come back and start driving more. And our noise data reflect this. So we see urban noise levels return to the levels that they were at before the lockdown, although there was a 2-year delay, right? The city was very much did repeated lockdowns. It was very careful. We saw a lot of people switch to working from home. So it's not really surprising that we had this delay. In fact, I was kind of hoping they would stay down, but that was wishful thinking. And again, back to this image of the background noise levels that we saw before, what did we see now? Well, we find that again, this is from 2023. We see again that spectral urban areas have that really high energy at low frequency. So what about the birds? What did they do? So they also started changing their song amplitude. Interestingly, it went down a little bit the next year, but then it came back up. So again, as noise is coming back into the system, right, with that 2-year delay on noise levels, we see that same 2-year delay on song amplitude. And we see that in urban and in rural slightly, right? There's a little bit of change in how people were using those parks, but we really see it in city areas. Now, notice that that signal to noise ratio dropped. So even though it had gone up during the lockdown, it went down and recovered a little bit, but really we see it back to where it was before the lockdown. So we don't see an improvement in the signal to noise ratio. So even though the birds are cranking up the volume, you might say, on their song, it's just so much louder that they can't maintain that beautiful ratio that they had during the lockdown. Interestingly, song traits are not changing. So even though we see this increasing noise, minimum frequency has stayed low in urban areas and vocal performance has stayed high. And we're in the process of analyzing data from 2024. And based on that initial pass, it's still not changing. So this is really interesting. Why? Why has it not changed? It's getting loud again. So that means you'd think that we would see a shift back to what these songs sounded like from before the lockdown. So why might this be? So I have some ideas. One could be, so this is the hand waving part of the talk here. So one could be that song amplitude is more important. It has a larger impact on signal transmission than minimum frequency. So if we think about the birds are trying to do two things, right? They're trying to increase that communication distance. They want receivers from as far away, right? Females from as far away to hear them, and males, to be stay far away from them so they can have nice big territories. And we know that they want to sound good, right? They want to sound like they have a high quality song to potential mates. So if they, as noise increases, if they're trying to increase the efficacy of their signal, perhaps that amplitude matters more in affecting the distance their song can travel than does minimum frequency. And we have some support for this idea. This is from Great Hits, so this is work in Europe, and it shows that if we think about how far a song travels, a given song, if we change the minimum frequency, it goes a little bit further, but if we increase the amplitude, it goes a lot further. So that work suggests that that's probably the case, but we haven't done those same measures in white crowns. That's work that's in progress. It could be that maybe there's sexual selection against lower performance songs. So females suddenly heard all of these males in 2020, and we see this real shift in the males with high performance songs holding territories. So perhaps it's going to take time for that pressure, right? For it to be so loud that females can't find those males, right? And so maybe that's sort of delaying this shift down. And again, remember in White Crowns, we find that they do respond more strongly to high performance songs. And so this is possibly the case. And it really, as a colleague of mine, Jesse Tanner, who works on sexual selection, likes to say, basically during the lockdown, females could suddenly hear males, and now like sexual selection could really work, right? We see it in effect, and that perhaps that impact on the population is going to last for a little while, at least until the pressures of the signal, the efficacy of the signal outweigh those of the potency. A third thing may be that the mechanism underlying that change in song amplitude is different from the mechanism underlying the change in minimum frequency and vocal performance. So what do I mean by that? Well, effectively, we can think about this plasticity as two different types. One is adults, right? Immediately flexible, something happens and you adjust in real time, versus developmental plasticity, which is that your conditions early in life affect your phenotype, and then that phenotype stays the same as an adult. So it may not be as flexible when you're older. And indeed, we see that in amplitude. So in song amplitude, we see immediate flexibility. So this is one male, and as the noise level increases, his song amplitude goes right up. And across the population, we see that both in rural and in urban areas, that birds that are in territories with higher noise levels, they sing songs at higher amplitude. So this immediate flexibility may explain why we see song amplitude changing in lockstep with changes in noise levels. Now, there's less evidence for immediate flexibility. We know there's some immediate flexibility in song traits like maximum frequency and bandwidth. At least in urban birds, we actually see more flexibility than we do in rural birds. So again, in blue, right, we see a difference where they change those song traits with noise, but in rural birds, they didn't do that. But interestingly, in neither population did we see a shift in minimum frequency. So even if we're, and this is not as good as the landscape level change that happened during the pandemic, but this is an experiment where we're taking speakers and we're putting them on a male's territory and we're blasting them with the noise. And if they don't fly off, if they keep singing, so it's a really hard experiment to do. If they stay and they keep singing, what we see is that they don't change their song, at least in terms of minimum frequency, in response to that noise. So how are they doing? How could you see a change in minimum frequency and vocal performance with changes in noise levels? What about development? So this is work that actually happened before the pandemic, and we didn't really understand what it meant until we had the lockdown. And so this is one of those things where you get to relook at data in a new way. So this is where we raised birds, baby birds. We brought them from California back to the lab. We raised them in sound attenuation chambers where we could control the sounds that they heard, the songs that they heard. And we had two groups of males. So we had control males who got to hear songs with a high minimum frequency and a low minimum frequency. And we had noise tutored birds. And these guys also heard the same songs, either high frequency or low frequency. The difference is that control and both sets of birds heard 2 hours of noise every day. So they got the same amount of stress from noise. But control birds heard the noise at a different time of day, and noise-tutored birds heard the noise at the same time that they heard those songs. And so what that meant was is that their high frequency songs were less masked, right? They're above the noise, and the low frequency songs were more masked. So what happened? So interestingly, control birds copied either song. In fact, they had some preference for copying that low frequency song, or a tendency for doing that. But in the noise-tutored birds, the majority, the vast majority, copied those less masked songs. And not only did they do it, when they then sing their song as an adult, they sang it with an even lower, an even higher minimum frequency. So they shifted up even more. And that had a cost in terms of performance. So they actually had lower performance songs. So this is interesting. This shows us that they are affected by noise when they're sort of early in that window where they're learning their song, and that it has a long-lasting effect in their song. And their songs don't actually change. So I don't have that figure here, but later, even when the noise was gone, they continued to sing those songs at a higher minimum frequency, suggesting that once they're adults, that song is not quite as flexible. So that may be that because that mechanism, if you imagine you have to have this sort of generational response, it's going to take longer potentially for those traits like minimum frequency to catch up and respond to noise pollution. So again, we find mixed support, suggesting, a couple questions are lingering. Why, song performance higher now? Why didn't they have high performance songs before the lockdown? And is this a robust system? I mean, it sounds like it's robust maybe to a point, but that once noise gets to a certain level, they can't maintain that signal to noise ratio. So in conclusion, I think we've shown that our communication system is resilient to noise, that some behavioral traits are slower to change in response, potentially for a number of different reasons. And it suggests that our communication system is also robust, at least to a point, to noise pollution, at least for this urban survivor, right? This is a bird that will set up territories and breed and is not extirpated in these noisy city areas, which is not the case for a lot of species. But in either case, it suggests that there's these non-parallel responses, which to me is fascinating as somebody who studies behavior, because we often think of behavior as extremely flexible, and it shows that that's not necessarily the case. And so this has brought me to thinking about this question about disturbance landscapes, right? Is there a tipping point, right, or a noise threshold? And is that the same for different species or different? And does it depend on how sensitive their hearing is to noise? Can we measure that difference, how different it is in that robustness and the resilience, which we can think of as hysteresis? And finally, how does this change from going from one type of environment to the other so quickly? How does that maybe impact the function of the signal? What does it mean for these birds that we now have a population of males that are singing at a much higher performance level than they did before? And finally, I just want to mention I'm part of a new animal behavior research group at the University of Tennessee. And if you're interested in our work, please check us out. Here's our landing page. We're so new, we don't have a website. But if you're interested in the work that we're doing and learning more about it, please reach out. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
So, um, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, start my video. Okay, there we, oh, and now you can see me. Sorry about that. Thank you so much, Liz. Well, I think we've long known that this is a fascinating species. It's been studied a lot in the past in terms of
Yes.
song and behavior, and you've made it even more so. So thanks very much for telling us about this, and of course for taking advantage of this remarkable experiment that would rather not have had.
That's
but but
very true. Yeah.
I'm trying to see if there are any questions yet. If anyone has a question, please do enter it in the or raise your hand. Trying to think of it. Here
I
we
see I see one in
here
the
we are. Here
Q&A.
in the Q&A.
Yeah.
Yes, we do
Yeah.
have a question. are some noise sources, such as different vehicles, more destructive than others?
That's a great question. So one of the things that I learned during the shutdown, the lockdown, that I never really fully appreciated, which is how quiet um, electric cars are. And like, and it is interesting because you think of them, really, we think about them in terms of reducing other types of pollution in our environment, but they really reduce noise pollution as well. And so one of my hopes and one of the things I kept talking about, I was like, if you're going back to work, maybe buy a hybrid or electric vehicle or something that's less noisy, because maybe we can not get, maybe we won't return to that same noise level. So yes, I definitely think that there is variation, and electric cars are the way to go. And you see immediate effects. You don't have to wait for the atmosphere to get better. You immediately see less noise pollution, and that has a great effect on birds.
And the sparrows will thank you. And presumably,
Yes.
I mean, do you have any sense of, yeah, I mean, as your
Yeah.
work and previous work on white-crowned sparrows, it's sort of become perhaps the canonical species for
Yeah.
studying bird vocalizations. Do you have any sense of the extent to which the kinds of patterns and responses to the noise environment that you've described, any sense of the extent to which that the same could be said in other bird species?
Yeah, so there's not as much on song as I was hoping. There's some things that are starting to trickle out from other studies, but it was really sort of serendipitous that we happened to have these recordings from before the lockdown that allowed us to do this. And I think people now who did record during the lockdown are starting to record afterwards. So at least maybe have some, after effects to look at. So there's not as much known there yet. There's a lot of more great studies that are coming out of thinking about like sort of ecosystem level responses. How did whole communities of birds, like who's present and who's absent? And so there's been some great analyses of like eBird data, right? And trying to, you have to control for the effect that suddenly everybody went outside and went on eBird, which is great. But you have to like account for that bias and observations. But it looks like there were some shifts and impacts on who was where, especially in areas that stayed quiet for long enough to really see a response, right? To who was in the habitat and who wasn't. Um, but yeah, I wish there was more in terms of behavior. There's been a lot of other sorts of studies done, but not as much with that.
Mhm. Um, uh, one listener, Seema, says thank you for your qualitative and interesting presentation. And
Thank
another
you.
listener asks, did territory size change in concert with the song change over time? Hmm.
That is such a great question. Um, I wish I knew the answer to that, and I don't. So one of the challenges with the study that we did is that normally we would go out, like a lot of people who study birds do, and we catch birds and we put bands, color bands on them so we could follow individuals. But during the lockdown, we were not allowed to do that. In fact, it was a lot of work to even allow us to go out and record them. So we had to negotiate with a number of California authorities to allow us to even walk around and record. And because we weren't able to ban or really follow them extensively, we couldn't measure territory size during the lockdown. My guess is that it did, right? Because there's songs, we do know there's this correlation. We do know that birds with larger communication distance have bigger territories, both within rural areas and within cities. And so my guess is that yes, they probably did space out a little bit more, but we don't really have the data. We can't test that. All these unanswered questions I wish I could answer.
Here's another question. I'm sorry for leaning so close in, but my eyesight isn't so great, and the type is
No,
very small.
it
Um,
is very small. So I'm happy to lean in too.
so is the lowering of the kilohertz of birdsong during the quietness of the COVID environment in any way connected to a bird's happiness, or is high frequency more indicative of bird happiness?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So I would say that by having a lower minimum frequency, the bird is able to sort of expand their song and occupy more acoustic space, right? And have that higher performance song. And we know that higher performance males are more likely to get territories. And we have some data suggesting that females prefer them. So if getting more mates makes you happy, then I would say yes. The happiness is a very hard quality to figure out in a bird. But yes, I think that there's one could suggest that. Yeah. It says, were the recordings with ARU Orm field recordings? So, so these, I think this person is talking about ARDs. So that's when you put out an automatic recording device out in the field. Interestingly, we did try to do that in San Francisco. We did that in 2014, and it was probably one of the best moments of my scientific career. I got a call from the police department of San Francisco indicating that they had just blown up one of my ARDs as a suspected bomb because a student of mine had put it too close to the Golden Gate Bridge. So
Oh,
we stopped using ARDs. So these are not recordings. These are all recordings by hand by individuals. This is a labor-intensive project. We do all of our measurements by hand. There's no AI or machine learning in it, which is not necessarily a bad thing. It's just I'm so old-fashioned. So we still go out and we record every bird on its territory. We know the individual of every song. We can go back and record that male over and over again, and then we take all those measurements in sound analysis software. Yeah.
mhm. Uh,
ARDs are cool. The San Francisco Police Department gets upset about them. So,
okay. Um, I'm not seeing more questions, but if anyone else out there has a question, here's someone says thank you.
yes.
We still certainly have time for a few more questions.
Um,
Uh,
this is Debbie. The people who are hosting the webinar can't type in the Q&A, but I just
Oh,
wanted to say that in Manhattan, we've recently enacted a congestion pricing system. And at least in my
yes.
neighborhood, traffic has dropped dramatically over the past 10 days. And it's just not really a question, but I wonder if the magnitude of that drop is enough to affect birdsong, or if it really takes a dramatic change in environment.
I think it's probably enough. And that's a great question. I wonder if there's any of the song people in New York. I hope their graduate students are out there
mm,
recording, like Ofer Chernikowski. I wonder. I'm gonna email Ofer. Say like, what do you have somebody out there recording? I hope you do. Um, Yeah, and or yeah, there's somebody else at Queens whose name's slipping my mind right now, but who would I'm sure must have a master's student who's thinking about this. There's some really great work on in New York on birds historically, right, and currently. So I feel like there's a number of labs that could get at that question, Debbie, and quantify that because we see sort of this. What's really interesting to me that I didn't get a chance to talk about in the talk is that we know that birds shift their song when it gets loud. It's called the Lombard effect. We do it too, right? You go to a party, it gets loud, you start talking louder, you probably lose your voice the next day. But when it gets quiet, you don't keep shouting, right? You drop your amplitude again. What's interesting about what we saw during the lockdown is that the change in amplitude was bigger than what we could explain by the Lombard effect. So something else was happening because it wasn't just a small change on this one bird's, in this little bird's neighborhood, his little party, because it was across that whole area. We saw a reduction that may have to do with social interactions. It may have to do with like being detectable by a predator. We don't know what the reason is. And so it's interesting about what you're talking about your street is that I'd be curious to see if it's over a large enough range that you could see not just the Lombard effect, but this real shift down in amplitude, which we know allows them to hear each other at a longer distance, which matters, right? So that's actually now I want to know the answer. Yeah.
Come to New
so
York and do your work.
right.
I know, right? It's too expensive. Although San Francisco is bad enough. trying to run a field site there. It's challenging.
So I have a few questions that vary in
Yeah.
terms of how far they depart from exactly what you've been talking about.
Yeah.
But one is so you've done all this work in in the San Francisco region, and
Yes.
the bird is, of course, the species is quite widespread, and
Yes.
and in general, do you have either data or impressions of whether there are regional differences in white-crowned sparrow song as a function of how noisy the environment is? Because some environments, even without traffic and so forth, are simply noisier than others, right? Uh,
Yes, yes, and so I love that it's that's a great question. So this is so I got two-parted answer. One is data based and one is hand wavy.
mhm,
So
mhm.
the
That's okay.
data based one is
I do
that
too.
yeah, that's good. That's the fun part, right? Um, the data based one is that I've been recording birds, white crowns along that whole coast for a long time.
Mm,
And I know that the songs vary with habitat in terms of how dense it is, right? So if it's a really open area, we get really fast songs, right, that are really wide bandwidth. And if we find areas that have like redwood trees or they're really more densely vegetated and lots of dense vegetation, they tend to be much slower and they tend to be narrower in
mm,
frequency. And we see that both spatially as well as over time when you see habitat change in a location. So like the songs in Marin, as that's become more forested, they've shifted over time. They've slowed down, and they've increased in bandwidth. So we know that those songs are responsive to environmental change. That's not noise, but it's a type of environmental change. Then the hand wavy part is that I wonder, and this is an N of one, so you can't test it. I wonder if the reason white crowns do persist in the city, unlike so many other birds that you find outside of the city, is because they are essentially pre-adapted, because they hold territories next to the ocean, right? They can hold territories there,
mm.
and ocean noise is really high energy at low frequency, that they already sort of had that plasticity or flexibility or whatever you want to call it, that they had that capacity. And so as it urbanized and it got louder, they were able to sort of persist and keep holding territories and communicate. um, that's the hand wavy part. I have no idea if that's the answer, but that kind of gets
I,
at your point, right? Is that
I can see a comparative species analysis that uses eBird data to start exploring that. Actually,
yeah,
I
yeah.
could easily imagine that. There presumably there are limits to learning. So white-crowned
Mhm.
sparrows and white-throated sparrows are in
Right,
the same genus,
right.
and have pretty different songs, different enough
Yes.
so that you'd never mistake one for the other. Do you think a white-crowned sparrow could learn white-throated song?
So early work. So this I got to put on either my Peter Marler hat or my Baptista hat. So this is a tricky question. I feel like I'm in my prospectus defense. So um if you think about Baptista's experiments that he did, where he did put that introductory note, that whistle, on different species songs like the strawberry finch and show that birds, white crowns, actually learn that song, which is much more different than a white throat, like very complicated.
Hmm,
They could learn it as long as I
really?
had that intro note. Yes,
Really?
that seemed to be the cue, that introductory note. Without that, they didn't. So that seems to be the piece. Peter Marler, I think, would say that they're not as flexible as that his experiments, were really looking at that sort of window, that they have a relatively narrow window to learn in, and that his work with Doug Nelson went on to show that they actually have an innate tendency to copy the song of their own subspecies, so that if you give them songs from the two
Mm,
different subspecies, they'll tend to copy their own over the other. And of course, both of those have that intro note. So either that subspecific information is in that intro note, or Baptista kind of got lucky, or he gave them enough social stimulation that you could get them to do that, but that at least in the wild, they probably wouldn't. Does that make sense? So I think that they can do it, but it's a bit of it's a maybe less likely than you would think. So
Okay.
that's my
So,
thought.
I invite audience members to send more questions, but while I'm asking one or two more, because
Yeah,
it's a rare opportunity to talk to someone who really knows, really knows
yeah,
about birdsong,
yeah,
and
yeah.
uh, so. So I'm thinking of sparrows. Okay, let's think of another genus. Swamp
Mm,
sparrow and song sparrow. I imagine
yeah.
you know their songs. I mean, they're
Yes.
close relatives in the same genus. I think
Yes.
there are only 3 or 4 species in the genus, and they're
Right.
radically different songs. I mean, the swamp
Yes.
sparrow you could almost confuse with a chipping sparrow if
Yes.
if you don't listen carefully. Whereas a song sparrow, as everyone knows, has this elaborate song. How do you
Yeah, they're
think you could
amazing.
get from one to another? Among
That's a great
such
question.
closely related species.
Well, so this is something so sort of the long-term thinking is that it has to do with the fact that they learn, right? And that we see because they learn that learning has an ability to be more flexible and that you can have cultural evolution, that cultural evolution can go faster than you think of genetical evolution. It has the capacity. And that could allow this amount of diversity to accumulate. But I did some work with Nick Mason, who was studying Aussies, and I was studying sub-Aussies, and we looked at rates of evolution in those two groups. And again, it's just a comparison of Aussies to sub-Aussies. But what's interesting is that they were not different; they were equally, you know, changing at an equal rate. So we actually,
I mean
I'm not
evolutionary
sure
rate. I mean evolutionary rate.
evolutionary rate.
Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah, the evolutionary rate of those traits. Now, there were some other differences that were interesting, but it wasn't as striking as I thought it was going to be. Some groups were, but just sort of overall, they're really quite fast in how they're changing. Um, in terms of how you get such big differences between groups, this has to do, I think, with this combination of inflexibility from this innate template, right? So that you have this template like that whistle, right? That's something that's cueing you to learn something, combined with the flexibility of being able to innovate on top of that. I think that combination of both that template that allows you to sort of say, okay, I have to learn in this space. So it really puts you on this path. You can't just go all over the place, right? So you could get this huge shift potentially, right? Thinking about, Mary Jane West Eberhard, right? Like you have just enough inflexibility that you can get on this sort of different developmental pathway. But then within that, the flexibility allows you to change quite
Mm.
rapidly. And so I think that's how you could get a song sparrow and a swamp
Mm.
sparrow, right? That are really close
I'm
relatives, but very
okay.
different
You
songs.
said something
Yeah.
that reminded me of something else I might want to
Yeah.
ask if we
Yeah.
have time. But
Okay.
meanwhile, Cheryl asks, is there any evidence that birds' ability to detect song
Mm.
as opposed to produce it is equally plastic?
Such a great question. So I asked NSF that question, and they said no. So I tried to ask that question. I did go to NSF and I said, "Look, we have this amazing data on song, but we don't know anything about receivers, right? About variation and plasticity." And the answer was at the time, this is like 10 years ago, was, well, hearing doesn't vary. It's if everybody hears the same way. And so like this is not an interesting question, which was shocking, but that's okay. But since then, Jeff Lucas has done amazing work in other species and actually a little bit in white-crowned sparrows, showing that there's a lot more variation in ability to detect song and that the birds actually don't just all hear the same and they don't hear like humans. That's really different from what we thought. And some of the things we knew, like owls are really different, right? Those aren't surprising. But that even within closely related sparrows, you can have really big differences in how they're detecting. Now the question comes is there individual variation and are individuals plastic? Do they change? Well, some work by Jeff Lucas suggests, and I think also Elliot Brinowitz may have shown this, that there's seasonal changes. So they do change in their how well they're detecting it. They get really good at it during the breeding season, right? So you can imagine that's a really expensive set of neural traits to have. And so like you kind of let those brain cells go when it's not breeding time, but then they get very responsive to certain frequencies. Like they get really good at detecting signals and noise during the breeding season. So because there's that seasonal variation within an individual, my guess is that there is individual variation. And I think there's probably differences between urban and rural birds, but I don't have any. I have to convince somebody who's an audiophysiologist to study that question.
It sounds like a good grant proposal that
Yeah,
you
I'll
could
try again
do
maybe.
with a collaborator. Okay, so this is a very different issue, but um, you have worked not only on white-crowned sparrows, but on
Yeah,
all these subassines in the
yeah,
tropics, on wood creepers and all those ant birds and all the many
yeah,
tyrant flycatchers and so on. And we learn, those of us who learn anything at all about birdsong, we learn that the Aussies learn their songs and the sub-Aussies basically have essentially more or less,
mhm,
genetically defined songs. As far as I have no idea how many species of Aussies versus sub-Aussies that statement is based on. My impression is very
very
few.
few, very,
And
very
so
few.
my question to you is, do you think it's the case that all of the antbirds and wood creepers and tyrant flycatchers and ovenbirds and all the rest of them, that they all have strictly genetically entrained songs, and that all the sparrows and the
Yeah.
warblers and the blackbirds and and everything else that we have learn their songs?
It seems like it would be silly to think that that's the case, right? I think that's the general feeling, and that's how we describe song. Just like I still call song, it's a male trait, it's loud, right? It has two functions. Almost all of the work in the last 10 years has shown that lots of females sing, right? Female song is ancestral. A song has like 5 or 6 functions. And you can have soft song, which soft song has an amazing function, right? A lot of work by Rindy Anderson. And so the fact that every sort of uh, you might say truism about birdsong has been turned over. My guess is that that's probably the next thing that will fall is this idea that there's a dichotomy. I will say that in Aussies, we know from work from a number of different labs that there's a huge amount of variation and just how flexible they are, right? You have some species, can just learn whatever and improvise and do all of these things their whole adult life. And then other species with a very narrow window, they only learn certain things. You think about swamp sparrows, right? They have, only X number of notes, like 9 note types, right? That they can learn, and they put them in lots of different combinations, but there's that limit on what they can do. And so because of that, not just what they can learn, but when they can learn it, how wide that window is, that critical window. So are you a lifelong learner, or are you only learning early in life? If there's that much variation in Aussies, my guess is that there's probably variation also in sub-Aussies. It's just that they're so much harder to study. There was a little bit of work done by Nat Seddon and Joe Tobias doing these hand rearings. That's sort of what you do. You do
Mhm.
these hand rearing experiments in antbirds, and they showed that at least in those antbirds, the few that they worked on, they didn't see any learning. Like you could take a chick and give it absolutely no song exposure, and they would still produce their song. But there's so many more,
But could you teach
yeah.
them a different dialect or another antbird song?
That's a good question that
And
hasn't been asked.
no one's done it. Wow.
Not that I know of. The only person who would have gotten close would be Krudsma, and like he might have some stuff, but not that I've seen. What's amazing is when you work on something, you think, oh, there's so many books about it, and yet there's still so much that we don't know, which is pretty
Wow.
amazing. Yeah.
Well, that sounds to me like if I were studying birdsong and I had graduate students studying birdsong, I think I'd assign them some antbirds and wood creepers,
Yes, that's true. Actually, I have a new graduate student who's from Brazil, Renata Becco, and she is doing a
Mm.
beautiful study on ant birds on females. And so she's looking at because almost Yeah, pretty much every antbird species, the female sings.
Oh.
Yeah, and it's one of the few, so it's about 220, I want to say, 225, kind of depending on where you split things. And she's recordings from all of those females, from all this work that's been done over the years, from by Eisler and Gustavo Bravo and Gabrielle Macedo, and all of that has led to this rich library. So I'm curious to see what she finds out with her work on them.
Okay. We have another question from Cheryl, and I think she referring back to an earlier question. Did you look at how often they sang? So I guess this would be again the frequency of how frequently birds are, whether or not that's affected by the noise environment that you were
Yeah,
describing.
yeah. So the 1 year that we had those ARDs, at those automatic recording devices, that really lets you look at vocal output,
Mhm.
day and night. And what's interesting is that we thought, our prediction was is that urban birds would just sing less during traffic hours, right? Like
Mm.
congestion, morning commute, evening commute, that they would stop singing. So that's not what we found. What we found instead was that urban birds sang a lot more than rural birds, like just a ton more song. And if you think about it, with noise detection theory, like how does signal detection work, that if you can't really hear each other well, one thing to do is just keep shouting the same thing over and over, right? Like if I sing it enough times, maybe you'll pick it out. And so that seems the way that they deal with it, is that they're just sort of overwhelming the system. So they sing a ton more. That's work by my collaborator, David Luther. Yeah, yeah,
Oh, that is fascinating. Oh, wow,
yeah,
what a good question and interesting answer.
yeah,
Wow,
yeah.
that is really, it would be so interesting to know how many of these generalizations apply, more broadly across many species. But
Yes, yeah,
that
yeah.
is that is really interesting. Hmm.
Yeah, that's what. Yeah, Haven Wiley has done sort of the best, so longest work on thinking about signals and noise, and it was actually him who said, "Well, look at the overall output, because I bet you that they just, if they don't adjust when they sing, they're just going to overwhelm the system. They're just going to keep repeating that message." And that's indeed what we found. We saw a huge amount of. David Luther was one of his students, so he's like, "We got to go test this prediction." Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Anyone else in the audience have any more questions for our speaker who has who has you've shown that you take any species of bird and you can study it indefinitely and keep finding really interesting things about its
As my
ecology, its
sister-in-law
behavior.
says, yeah, my sister-in-law is like, "How are you still studying the same bird 25 years later?"
Anyway,
Right?
so let me thank you so much for a really fascinating story, and I think you've certainly opened my ears up to birdsong in the urban wilderness, and I think and shown how much more how rich a subject it is, and how much more there is
Yes.
to be done. So thank
Thank
you
you. Thank
thank
you.
you so much. Really
Well, thank you
appreciate
for
it.
inviting me. It's lovely to be able to have this conversation and to be able to talk to all these people. So thank you
That's right.
again for
and
inviting me.
and and thanks to all the audience members who have come in and listened and contributed questions. And we'll see you again in about a month for the next presentation. So thank you and good night, Toby.
Thank you. Thank you. Good night.